Hi, welcome back. This is the second part of the Introduction to Sentencing lecture, focusing primarily on evidence-based sentencing, both its kind of implementation and issues surrounding such, as well as kind of more specifically the couple of different versions of evidence-based sentencing affirmative that the campus is making available, as well as the various negative strategies against those ends. If you have not already watched the first part, you should do so. It is, available on YouTube, same title, set part 1 of 2 and set 2 of 2. When we left off, though, we were talking about evidence-based sentencing, and in particular, had given a quick kind of primer on actuarial risk assessments, what they entail and what they are. I last said that what they are designed to kind of predict and measure, not measure, but predict, is recidivism risk, i.e., the probability that somebody is going to reoffend at some point in the future and thereby re-enter the criminal justice system. Now, one thing that it is very important to note about actuarial risk assessments is that they initially, have for quite a while now been used at a number of other stages in the criminal justice process. They are not new to the criminal justice system, but they are fairly new to sentencing, i.e. they've been used at other stages of the process for a while, but their introduction to sentencing is a new and somewhat discrete question for reasons that we'll get into momentarily. Some of the other uses that they, to which they're kind of very frequently put are, people will often use them for bail determinations. So trying to figure out how likely it is if somebody is kind of let out on bail that they will, skip bail, they'll skip town and not show up for their trial. People will, their kind of most prominent use and the use that they were to which they were kind of first put is at the corrections stage. So the rationale there is to try and assess the likelihood based on, again, kind of a conglomeration of different characteristics related to kind of the person's membership in various categories, what the probability is that they will currently reoffend, and use that information to try and change that, change what happens in the future, right? So if you think that there's a pretty low risk that someone is going to reoffend, then kind of going straight into, being relatively lenient with the way that they're kind of handled by the system, and going pretty straight into a set of rehabilitation and potentially early release options makes a lot of sense and is very straightforward. The argument that the kind of proponents of use of actuarial risk assessments at corrections make is that, number one, you are likely to be much more able to kind of confidently employ some of those kind of more lenient options with somebody if you have an additional very useful data point that establishes pretty clearly that it's quite unlikely that they will reoffend if you do so. But on the flip side, it also means that for the set of people for whom that isn't true, you have the opportunity to kind of intervene in that in various ways. So maybe it means that you are kind of like more forceful in your handling of the situation, but then also kind of provide them access to a set of resources designed to take somebody with a pretty high predicted recidivism rate and try and kind of like decrease that in various ways. Again, some of that might be rehabilitative, some of it might be kind of harsher punishment. It just depends. But that's the theory, and in theory that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, there certainly are people who take issue with the use of them at all, or alternatively with their use in particular ways, or kind of how that evidence is used. But certainly the kind of fundamental thought process there is sound. The issue is, as those risk assessments are taken and applied at sentencing, a lot of that underlying rationale begins to break down almost entirely. Because while it makes a lot of sense to be like, the probability that this person will reoffend in the future is going to shape the ways in which I kind of apply their punishment and the ways that I kind of like try and shift that future risk. At sentencing, you have not yet received your punishment. And so you are taking that future recidivism risk and being like, the odds that they will commit a crime at some point in the future are potentially X%. I'm going to use that as one of the determinants of how I punish them for the crime they have already committed in the present. And that is the thing that makes many people very uncomfortable for, I would say, pretty good reason, right? Fundamentally, what you are saying then is, it very much is kind of, for any of you who've seen the movie Minority Report, it's that sort of kind of thought process, right? It's like a very much kind of a thought crime thing, at least arguably. It also gels very poorly with a lot of the kind of fundamental rationales for what is going on at sentencing that I talked about in that first video, right? So if your goal is to ensure that somebody gets their kind of due, their just desserts, i.e. the goal of punishment is kind of proportionate retribution, then risk assessments don't help you with that even a little bit, right? They are very much not designed to kind of figure out what somebody currently deserves. Instead, they're giving you a possible prediction of kind of the way they will behave in the future. Similarly, it has no real place in kind of a vision of justice and punishment that is guided by some of the other kind of normative rationales I laid out, like, mercy or and the like, or even arguably rehabilitation for reasons that I'll get to more here in a minute, because there certainly are proponents who claim that it is. But at root, it makes the most sense by far if the role of sentencing is first and foremost to kind of preserve the safety of the broader public, right? Because if the role of prisons is mostly just to segregate some set of people from society, such that the rest of the people in society do not need to be impacted by the sets of crimes that they would otherwise commit, then yeah, then measuring future recidivism risk makes some amount of sense, because it, in theory, gives you a little bit, some additional useful information about whether or not they can be kind of like released. The thing that it's really important to realize, though, is if that is the calculation that's being made, then really what you are saying is this person dangerous enough that they need to be in jail as opposed to, out in public? Now, that is kind of a fraught enough question already, right? But one enormous complicating factor there as well is when we talk about recidivism risk, that doesn't speak at all to the level of severity of whatever crime might be committed, right? It speaks only to the idea that a crime of some sort might be committed. And so when these risk assessments are calculating recidivism risk, they are not saying this person is likely to be some very violent, dangerous offender in the future, therefore they need to not be in public. They will spit out that percentage probability whether the expected offense is likely to be kind of a large scale violent one, severe violent one like that, or just some sort of like relatively low level theft or robbery or shoplifting or whatever the thing may be, right? And so that is kind of a very important additional kind of qualitative layer that these risk assessments, at least current ones, do not really take into account, but that bears very directly on the thing that we established a minute ago is the only real kind of normative rationale in a lot of ways that makes sense for this, i.e. throwing people in jail to kind of protect the public from them, because there very much is a societal idea that like crime is bad and scary and dangerous, but that is not necessarily true, right? A thing that is a crime is only a crime because it is in violation of some law. But that doesn't mean that by virtue of violating that law, you're likely to violate all of these other laws, nor that you are some kind of like dangerous offender who's, a risk to the people around you. It just means that you violated a law. And there are all kinds of different things that can mean. So lumping all of them together doesn't make a great deal of sense. But zooming out real quick, taking a step back, I kind of traced the development of mandatory minimums in that first video. And the situation with evidence-based sentencing is very reminiscent of that, insofar as much like mandatory minimums and the kind of mandatory guidelines came about initially in the 80s because of kind of a weird kind of strange bedfellow situation of people on the right who wanted to reduce crime and people on the left who wanted to reduce racial inequality and disparity. There's now a situation where mass incarceration is clearly way out of control. There are tons, people are systematically over-sentenced. That is deeply violent and deprives a bunch of individuals of fundamental liberties. But it also is very expensive. And there are people who, there are people on the right who are primarily focused on and concerned about some element, some combination of the kind of individual liberty in a vacuum piece of this, the kind of like social libertarian folks, and the kind of extreme cost and amount of money that, taxpayer money that means governments are spending on incarcerating people. And so as a result, there are a lot of people on the right who are, push for kind of reductions in mass incarceration. And one of the major tools that they kind of point to as an effective means of doing this are actuarial risk assessments. Now, similarly, on the left, it's very clear that, judge discretion was feared in the 80s, probably not wrongly, as potentially smuggling in a bunch of kind of racial bias and resulting in disproportionate sentences as a result of that. But we now have very clear and conclusive evidence from a long period of time that the mandatory minimums established in response to that not only didn't fix the problem, they in a lot of ways made it worse, right? They meant that there were far more Black people being incarcerated for a lot longer, and caused some of those kind of socioeconomic and racial disparities in terms of how likely you are to be sentenced for a given crime, how severe that sentence is likely to be, and so on, to get worse instead of better. So we know that the current situation is just not working. And the proposal is that we adopt, and so their angle on actuarial risk assessments / evidence-based sentencing is that they will help us solve, the thing that the right and left, who are both pushing for this, agree on, is that they will help us solve this kind of, core problem, regardless of what the reason you care about it is, of kind of systematic over-sentencing by giving judges an additional piece of information that allows them to look at, kind of like with the corrections people we talked about earlier, look at a given individual and be like, whereas ordinarily they would have to kind of subjectively make a determination of like, is this person enough of a risk to society or to themselves or whatever, that we are going to, that, they need to be sent to jail, or is there, plausible case to be made for the sentence being either shorter or less severe, or, kind of doing something like supervised probation or, a community-oriented track like that, or diverting them to other kind of more rehabilitative treatments, depending on what sets of things are available for the type of crime they committed, as opposed to like actual hard jail time, right? And that is a noble goal. The problem is that it often doesn't really play out that way. So the reason that it might go that way is that this lets you look at that person who otherwise you would send to jail and be like, their rate of recidivism is likely to be very low. That makes me feel much more comfortable pulling the trigger on diverting them out of the kind of like, carceral system proper. But the problem is that as an empirical matter, they, actuarial risk assessments of sentencing very commonly result in kind of an increase in the number of people that we're incarcerating, not a decrease. And, while that's debatable, there certainly are good reasons to believe that that might be the case, which I'm going to speak to briefly now. So the core of the problem here is kind of like I said earlier, recidivism risk is a weird thing to be latching onto and trying to measure here, because it is in several different senses not super relevant to the decision that is being made in terms of like whether or not to sentence them. Additionally, one major problem is that many of the inputs are very heavily predictive of race and class and gender, right? Race especially. There's almost no variable that one could point to in the United States today that isn't correlated in some way with race, and many of them are extremely heavily correlated, whether it's like your income level, your level of educational attainment, your parents' level of educational attainment, what sort of job you like, even things like what kind of music you like all of these different very disparate variables are all very heavily predictive of race. It's very easy for an algorithm to kind of take in some of those inputs and spit out what it thinks your race are, and what it thinks your race is, and it'll be right a huge chunk of the time. What that means is that for the same reason, even when in terms of like designing these algorithms and figuring out what variables they should consider, people explicitly strike the use of race or gender, often because of fear of unconstitutionality of using those factors. It doesn't actually eliminate the kind of very heavy influence that race has over the outputs. And so as a result of that, it is these algorithms very systematically recommend or predict a much higher rate of recidivism on the part of Black people, and especially young Black men. And the reasons for that are, in large part determined by a lot of these other inputs, right? And so the kind of retort from people on the right is, yeah, but it's because they commit more crimes. And there's an argument that at least to some degree in some cases that may be true, although the kind of roots of the reasons for that are, run much deeper and are very deeply grounded in, systemic racism and structural inequality. But there also were a bunch of layers at which, even like that is, heavily magnified beyond the degree to which it is true. As a result of things like the fact that they interact with police far more often. The police are kind of very actively patrolling their communities, and are also much more prone to kind of like escalate quickly to the use of force, are likely to kind of systematically over police those communities. As a result of which, you are much more likely to have a prior criminal record if you are Black, and especially again a young Black man. You are also, much more likely to be in poverty, either in absolute or relative terms. You are much more likely, on average, to, have a number of those different factors that are viewed by these risk assessments as each, risky and predicting a high likelihood of future reoffending. But, the white person who like smoked weed and was not arrested for it or whatever, does not have that counting against them as a risk factor. Similarly, the mere fact they are wealthier or likely to be counts heavily in their favor. And so the question here is not necessarily, I mean, there is a question about like how accurate these things are, because there's very good evidence that they might not be very accurate at all, and there's substantial disagreement on that. But even if they are accurate, what is it actually telling us? And are we using it in a way justified by what it's telling us, right? So like, even if it is accurately predicting likelihood of future reoffense, the idea that that means that now, in the present, we should give those people a much stiffer prison sentence is like a whole other question, a whole other ballgame, right? And that's, that much more true when, like I said earlier, these algorithms are not taking into account the severity of the crime that it expects you to commit and such. So as a result of all of that, and this is kind of further complicated by the fact that very often, the vast majority of the time, in fact, one does not know exactly what all of the inputs that went into the algorithm are, because they are mostly provided by these private sector tech companies who have, IP protection, like trade protection concerns about divulging the kind of ways that their algorithm operates, in addition to the fact that they're very worried that if they were to kind of make a lot of those things public, then it would be very easy to game them, and their kind of predictive accuracy and value would kind of fall apart a little bit. So given all of that, sorry about that. Go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and then when we come back, we will dig into some of the specifics of the affirmative and negative in light of everything that I've said so far. Okay, so that's a brief overview, brief-ish, of sentencing and of EBS in particular. Using that as a jumping off point, let's talk about the Aff. So there are two versions of the evidence-based sentencing Aff that Georgetown has produced. The first is evidence-based sentencing is bad, and the federal government should not do it. This one, is pretty agnostic as to the actor that makes that the case. It also does not apply to or claim to the states. The argument is just that evidence, you know, use of actuarial risk assessments at sentencing is messed up. It is ineffective and doesn't give us the sort of information we think it's giving us. But beyond that, it also is just deeply problematic insofar as, again, it in a very real sense increases people's jail time systematically based on their race, based on the fact that other members of that race are expected to reoffend at a higher rate at some point in the future. They are, you know, we are making the determination to kind of like sentence people more harshly now. Now, one thing I should have said a little while ago and didn't is, in theory, these, you know, even places that are using actuarial risk assessments, which is becoming much more common, and over the last few years, the kind of federal sentencing guidelines I talked about earlier, as well as, you know, numerous other kind of sources of guidance for federal judges have been revised to much more heavily center these. They are becoming much more common, despite the fact that, again, they were not initially designed for this purpose. And in fact, people who designed them initially for corrections have been very emphatic that they believe it should not be used for sentencing for the reasons we've already identified. Despite that, again, becoming much more common. And there are a variety of reasons why it's really problematic. Again, it largely punishes you based on skin color. It also, to a very real degree, you know, operates using a very specific conception of risk that understands risk, that really kind of serves to conflate risk and danger, right? So like, because of the stuff I was saying a little while ago about the fact that it's like recidivism risk, not the probability they're going to do something violent or something like that, it renders kind of any crime a potential threat that justifies, you know, viewing this person as riskier than this other person. And based on that, it pretty explicitly is like, if they are riskier in that way, that makes them more deserving of prison, which is a whole other question that begs a bunch of, you know, is fundamentally a question begging about like what the role, again, as I discussed, is of sentencing, of incarceration, and so on. And so there are, you know, a variety of other concerns that one might raise with a lot of this, but those are a couple of the big ones, as well as the fact that, again, just like as an empirical matter, as a result of all of this, it tends to increase incarceration. And that's because while nominally use of these things is optional, and, you know, even where the judge is required to be given that set of information, they do not have to abide by it. They largely do, and recent studies especially, have been pretty conclusive that, like, for the most part, if a judge is given that number by one of these algorithms, they take it very seriously and think that it is likely to be pretty accurate, even though it very often, there's also very good evidence that very often is not. And the reason for that is just because we typically think that, like, you know, these machines that are giving us information know what they're talking about and are, in a very real sense, kind of objective and value neutral and scientifically well-grounded. But somebody designed that algorithm, people designed that algorithm, and they have biases and they will smuggle them in. And even if they do not, or even to the extent that they don't or manage to counter those, society itself is structured such that there are a lot of those kind of structural biases, right? So like, this gets back to the stuff I talked about earlier about likelihood of reoffending and such. So all that being said, this first version of the app is like, it's bad for all these reasons. We shouldn't do it. It's objectionable. The neg obviously gets to say that we should do it, that those things are good. And that's true both for kind of like turns the case type reasons, i.e. it, you know, they provide us an effective means of, they are accurate, and they provide us an effective means of allowing a set of people to kind of go free, and also to kind of, you know, re-enter the community, get probation, etc., who otherwise would not be, especially African Americans. And, you know, in addition to that, you obviously, there are a variety of other kind of arguments that one can make. One thing that I will say as an aside that I meant to address in the first video is one very important effect of this increase of discretion on the, or this drastic decrease in discretion on the part of judges, is a corresponding large increase in the amount of discretion available to prosecutors in the US criminal justice system. And the reason for that is because, you know, if you take a step back and think about it, when judges could decide to sentence someone however they wanted, they were kind of like fully in control, right? So like pre-mandatory minimums, pre-sentencing guidelines, a judge would look at the situation and be like, you know, here are the sets of things that this person deserves. And so prosecutors, by extension, had relatively little control over that outcome, and by extension, relatively little leverage, right? Because whatever they would, you know, kind of like charge the person, then the judge would gather all of this information about the situation and make an informed decision. Now that, you know, a given crime carries a mandatory or at least like quasi-mandatory requirement that somebody be sentenced at least, you know, so harshly, prosecutors have a ton of discretion or a ton of influence over the process, because they get to decide, you know, in the first place, what charges are they going to bring, right? If someone has broken a law and they've been arrested or whatever, but they are not charged for it, that's a thing that prosecutors can and do decide all the time, and that is absolutely their legal right, and the case just like dies there. There is no charge this person. It's as though the person never committed the crime. But even once they do decide to charge them, they have a lot of flexibility in terms of deciding what statute they're going to charge them for violating, or what set of laws. And so when you layer on mandatory minimums, and especially add in things like 3 strikes laws, you can get a situation where a prosecutor is like, okay, if we go to trial, I'm going to charge you, you know, with this law that has a 10-year mandatory minimum, and this law that, you know, doesn't have a mandatory minimum, but it gives you a second strike, and this other third law so that you have a third strike, which, you know, increases the amount that you're guaranteed to go to prison if you're found guilty to like 20 years or whatever. And be like, or you can plead guilty to this other much more minor offense. You'll get 1 year in prison, and, you know, you'll be done with it, but you'll have this on your record. That results in a very heavy pressure toward plea bargaining. And as a result of which, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 94, 95, 96% of people who are found guilty in the US criminal justice system are not found guilty in a trial. They plead guilty, which is an enormous number. And almost certainly a sizable chunk of those people are innocent and didn't commit the crime in the first place. But that cost-benefit calculus is just not worth it in some cases if there's like a plausible chance that you'll be found guilty and the kind of cost is so wildly disproportionate. The corollary to that, though, is that prosecutors could decide to just not do those things, right? They could decide to not ever use a statute that has a mandatory minimum. They could decide to pretty systematically under-enforce or undercharge crimes that minorities are systematically much more likely to be arrested for, or, you know, whatever. Like, there are a wide range of levels of the process and ways in which a prosecutor can exert discretion to make things worse and more racially biased, and also kind of, you know, increase mass incarceration, or to do the exact opposite of that, because they are kind of the first main stage of this. They immediately precede sentencing, and they have the leverage and authority to decide all of these things. And so, by extension, I think a very prominent sentencing generic this year is the counterplan to have the have the DOJ or whatever establish a set of internal binding policies that have prosecutors mirror the effect that the plan would have in terms of its reduction in mass incarceration and stuff, but without the need to reform sentencing. And so, in terms of thinking about the neg against this Aff, that is, I think, kind of one really relevant thing, is to the extent that they solve actual kind of direct material violence, you can achieve that same effect with this other, with this kind of sentencing generic, and then read some DA to restricting evidence-based sentencing itself. The challenge, of course, is figuring out what that net benefit is, but there are, a variety of options to be had. The thing that I want to talk about now, though, is the other version of the EBS Aff, namely the version of evidence-based sentencing that you are, I think, probably likely to be reading is a little bit more complicated and different from all of this. In fact, actually, now that I think about it, I'll probably separate that out into a different video. So we'll call this one here, talk about that one in here in a minute, and then, I'll try to keep that last video very short, and you'll be on your way.